Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. My name is Stephanie Toddy from ExamSoft, and I'd like to welcome everyone today to our webinar entitled Collaborative Examination Item Review Process in a Team-Taught Course, hosted by Laurel Sampognaro, Clinical Associate Professor, David Caldwell, Director of Professional Affairs, and Adam Pate, Assistant Professor, all from the University of Louisiana, Monroe School of Pharmacy. Before we begin today's presentation, I have just a couple of housekeeping items that we need to go over. If you have specific questions, we encourage everyone to ask them throughout the webinar. You can type them in the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel at any point. Should be on the right-hand screen about halfway down. We'll have a chance to answer all questions and go over those at the end of the presentation. Also, at the end of the presentation, you should have a quick survey pop up for you. We encourage everyone to please, if at all possible, fill that survey out so that we can continue to provide relevant content at all of our presentations. If you're interested in viewing past webinars or registering for upcoming webinars, which we have quite a few at the moment, you can view the entire list with descriptions at learn.examsoft.com/resources. Guys, if you would forward to the next slide so everybody can see where to post their questions at. We are recording today's presentation, and all attendees and registrants will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording in the next few days. Please feel free to share that among your peers as you would like. We'll make sure that you get not only a recording of the presentation, but a copy of a PDF of the slide deck as well. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn everything over to our presenters. Thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the webinar.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everybody for being with us, and thank you for the introduction. Hopefully after today you guys will have a much clearer picture of how to actually go about creating a team process in reviewing items using item statistics and how to make your examinations better for your students. I'm Adam Pate. We're going to be tag teaming this. And so our objectives are that we're going to really describe how to implement an item review process, and we're going to use what we did here at Louisiana Monroe as an example for that. Then we're going to talk about potential barriers, some that we experienced and some that we anticipate others may. And then we're going to talk about and hopefully get some questions for some ideas to help you guys to establish this process at your respective institutions. So before we go any further, it'll help frame the discussion a lot, I think, for you guys to have an understanding of how we are structured in our curricula. And so what we really have is that we are a team-taught modular curriculum. And so in that, it's not unusual. We have two different departments, a basic science department and a clinical department. And we have courses. It's not unusual to have anywhere from 5 to 10 instructors in a course. And it's also commonplace to have sometimes 3 to even 6 instructors on one exam. And so with that being the case, we found that many people working in one area sometimes on exams can be a little bit of a challenge. And so we created a review process to limit variability of content and quality of exam items in the course. So what we kind of found when we were in our school was that, number one, we thought everybody, and I'm hoping everybody can see my mouse, but this is how we thought all of the course coordinators who oversee the course, we thought them and other faculty members were looking at our questions for exams much like this person, staring into their computer screen, intently looking at the questions and trying to decide if it's a good question, a bad question, and make improvements. What we discovered in reality is that a lot of times that was not occurring because people didn't have time and it wasn't really carved out time for them to take and look at each question on an exam in that much detail. It was occurring in some courses but not across the board. And then the other thing we found was that there was really only personal opinion to decide between good and bad questions. So a good question, it'd just be like, hey, I love that question. A bad question, it'd be relatively the same. I disagree with this question. We didn't have a firm foundation to decide between the two. And then we also had a relatively young group of faculty members at the time. And so if we're being honest, a lot of us didn't have much of an idea of how to write a good question. And so that being the case, we really didn't know and were worried about the influence that may have on our students' grades. And so we thought, would this influence students' grades on how we write the questions? And we didn't want that to be a factor. So we decided to start this item writing process. And deciding to start it was pretty easy because it just made sense. But then actually planning and executing it became a challenge. And so one thing that we really did not want to occur was we did not want the, oh my God, I can't attend another boring meeting that is mandatory. So we didn't want people to be unexcited about coming, and we didn't want it to be a wasteful meeting. So we wanted to figure out how can we get from being bored to this, where everybody's standing ovations and excited about us having these meetings. And then we also wanted to, since people can tend to take their questions a little personal, we wanted to avoid having to implement a cage match to make this thing work. So we didn't want anybody to be taking it personal. We didn't want it to be conflict between instructors who were on exams. And so in order to do this, the first thing was we had to set the right tone, and we did that in our first meeting. And planning that first meeting, we were very intentional about that. We had to, and we made it effortful to make the meetings practical and meaningful. And so each meeting we wanted to make sure that there was something that the people who were involved in those meetings took away and actually could improve on. And so that it didn't feel like they were just coming and people were bashing their questions and they were leaving. We also, again, in that same sense of bashing questions, we wanted to avoid the conflict and personal feelings. And so in order to do this, our first step was establishing a baseline knowledge and understanding of item writing. And so when we went to do that, we had two faculty members that had experience in item writing, and what they did was they went over, and as a group, we had a short, probably 20-minute kind of faculty development type program where we reviewed this set of guidelines, which the references at the end of this presentation. And so we reviewed these guidelines, which are from 27 textbooks and 27 research studies. And this group of authors led by Haldana had 43 item writing guidelines, which are really just good kind of principles to work from. And so we looked at these, and everybody, on that first meeting, we came to a consensus on these item writing guidelines. Do we want to use them? Do we agree with all of them? And we had just kind of open discourse about them after the development session. Also, just kind of a shameless plug here for September the 13th, David and myself will be giving another presentation, another webinar with ExamSoft, where we're going to go into more detail on the specifics of item writing and not so much on the process that we're describing here. So before we go further, there's probably, I know we have people that are all across the board. There's probably some people in attendance who could teach me several things about point by serial and difficulty, but there's others who those numbers may not mean anything. And so we're going to go over them real quick because they're going to come up later in the presentation. And so the point by serial, or RPB, as it's commonly referred to, is really just tells us discrimination of an item, and it looks at a student's performance on the whole exam and then their performance on the single question that we're looking at. And so it makes the assumption that students who perform well on the exam should perform well on questions on the exam in that specific question you're looking at. Generally, it's accepted that greater than or equal to 0.2 is good, and the higher the better. Realizing that once you get to an RPB of 1, that means that the item didn't discriminate anybody. 100% of the class got that question correct is most likely the case. The p-value is the difficulty, or the percent of students that get that question correct. And so p-value tells us if 60% of the class got it right, or maybe 30 or 40% got it right. That tells you how challenging that question in and of itself is based on the whole entire class. And so we use these RPV and p-values together in order to gauge the quality of an item. moving forward and try to interpret more in depth on what the students may or may not have been tricked by, or ways to maybe improve questions. So that's what those are used for. So we as a faculty understood that, but we also didn't have any really good way to classify, what is a good, because obviously the higher your RPB value or discrimination, then the better, but where does that trade-off occur in that it may discriminate very, very well, but if 20% of the class gets it wrong, or if only 20% get it right, then when do you throw it out, when do you keep it? We found this item classification guide, and we found it to be a good rule of thumb for us to kind of just look at and use as a rough guide. And so you can see that it's broken down in item difficulty based on p-value, and then by serial number. So if your point by serial is 0.2 or greater and you fall within this item difficulty, this would be considered a level 1 item, best item statistics, and use a majority of these. Now, all of these have to be taken into consideration, giving that the fact that when you're looking at an item, there's some things that are going to be what we consider essential knowledge. And so if it's essential knowledge, meaning that every student should get it correct, then I think that we kind of all agreed when we had a discussion on these guidelines, and especially this classification guide, that would be okay to have a number that was, a level 4 question, which is extremely easy, use, but they give us this use unless content is essential. And so at that point, it doesn't really matter if it is essential knowledge, then we can use that. So this is a good kind of base use guide for what to do when you get your item stats back. Another thing that we did in our first meeting was we discussed the guidelines at large, and we came to group consensus on usage of contested guidelines. And so right on this slide, this is how all the guidelines are broken down in that set of guidelines, and that it's listed. And then it has the percent of sources that were for it. Whoa, that was a little fast. Sorry, let me go back here. Hold on. So as you can see here, let me go back. Now, I won't push that button again, promise. But as you can see here, we use positives and no negatives. So the percent that was for that, then you have the percent where the resources it was unsighted, and then you have the percent that were against it. And you can see that all of these are relatively in one way or another contested. And so as a group, we came to consensus on what do we believe about these, and how do we see these being used for us. So do we agree that we should use positives and no negatives? And we did come to a consensus and say yes, we would prefer positively stemmed questions unless the negative was a important negative. And so we all came to a group consensus of avoiding all of the above, carefully using none of the above, which for us meant do not use none of the above, and then writing as many plausible distractors as we could. We settled as a group on using 4 as the ideal, but 3 would be okay if the other distractors were appropriate. And so that's kind of how we set it up, and that's the first meetings. And I'm going to turn it over to Laurel now, who's going to go over the more details of the process.
Okay, excuse me. So I'm going to talk about, like you said, the logistics of the process. So who is involved? David and I both are co-coordinators for our self-care series, which is a 4-hour, the self-care 1 is a 4-hour course that's offered every spring semester, and self-care 2 is a 2-hour course that's offered in the fall. In the first self-care, we have 11 faculty, and the second 9 faculty participate, and about half of the number participates in both courses. And so when we initially began and we started discussing participation, we really felt that it was very important that all faculty that are involved in the course agree to and are willing to participate. So even if you didn't write exam items for a certain exam, all of the faculty that teach in the course would participate in the review process. So what we did is we set the deadline for exam items, and this obviously is something that we had always done in the past, but we extended this deadline so that we asked that all items be submitted 2 weeks before the date of the actual exam. So we created a folder in ExamSoft and shared it with all the faculty that were going to contribute items to each exam, and they were asked to upload their test questions by the deadline, and then myself or David as the coordinator would download a PDF of the exam and then email that draft out to all the instructors in the course. And we would usually allow at least 3 to 4 days, quite often up to a week, to give them time to prepare. And basically what we asked everybody to do is just read through every item on the exam, think back to what we learned through the faculty development and the test writing guidelines that we had agreed to use and or not use, and then be prepared to come to the meeting with suggested revisions and or questions about each item. So we had set the meetings well in advance so that everyone tried to make sure that everyone's schedule would allow for as many to attend as possible. And we really tried to create an environment that was very laid back, informal, just to I guess encourage everyone to feel comfortable asking questions and sharing what they think per each item. And so the discussion really was quite lively everywhere. I mean, really people came very, very well prepared. And we would just go item by item and just say, okay, does anybody have any suggestions and or questions about item 1? And we would just move through the exam that way. And very often we deferred to the author to ask questions, especially if it was more content related. And then we would all come to an agreement in the end as to whether we would change a question based upon the discussion. And the follow-up after the meeting, David or I as coordinators would go into ExamSoft and update the items based upon whatever was agreed upon during the meeting, so that the authors of each exam item were not responsible for going back into ExamSoft and updating their questions based on what we talked about. And one more thing about the environment our campus has, we actually have 3 campuses not located in the same city, and so we were all able to participate via video conference so that everyone's input could be received. So for us, what worked well, like I said before, all of the faculty that taught in both of these courses agreed to volunteer. Well, yeah, they volunteered and agreed to participate, and they really bought into the process. The meetings were extremely well attended, and our faculty came to the meetings very well prepared for the discussion. One thing that is unique about these self-care courses is that all instructors who teach in the courses are from the clinical department, so we didn't have any cross-departmental lines to cross. Pretty much everybody adhered to those formats that Adam discussed that we agreed to not use, such as the K-type and the negative stems. And during the discussion, we really kept it, everybody was able to not take revisions and questions about their own exam items personally. So some barriers to implementation, and these are not necessarily barriers that we encountered as we worked through this process in the self-care modules, but some of us have implemented this process in other modules and have encountered some of these barriers, and just, if we haven't encountered them, anticipated that some of you might. So, you may have some resistant faculty. There may not be 100% buy-in, especially from the beginning, that A, they want to adhere to the guidelines at all, and or B, that they want to participate in the process. Very often in team talk courses, they do involve faculty from multiple disciplines and or departments, and so there again, that can create some resistance and some difficulty in communication. And we, down in the right-hand corner, we definitely don't want it to be a screaming match, but that we would all be open, willing to listen and communicate together. And again, just buy-in. Sometimes it may be hard to try to encourage participation from the beginning. They may not see the usefulness of it. They may say it's just another meeting. They don't have time to put the time in and the effort to be ready for the meetings. But really, where we came from this from the very beginning, just like Adam says, we want our students to be as successful as they can, and in that, they really need the best examination given to them, and that's provided by us. So now that we've talked about how the process works, we're going to discuss about how we assess the process. So in the spring and fall of 2012, both courses were delivered, and we used that as our control sequence. There was no training as far as item writing guidelines goes, and we did not implement the peer review process at all. We had 6 exams over those 2 courses, and then in the spring and fall of 2013 is when we placed our intervention. So the first thing that we did is we gave a pre-semester survey. This survey assessed faculty confidence and success at writing test questions. It also asked about their past experience with utilizing exam writing guidelines and/or peer review process. We asked about how they thought the process would affect item quality, and also to rate their confidence in incorporating this process into future courses. And then after that, we had the initial meeting that Adam described, where the 2 faculty members provided faculty development on the guidelines that we would use, and we agreed to use and not to use certain formats. Then throughout the semester, we implemented the process the way that I just described. And then at the end, the post-semester survey, the same survey was given again. And so now David is going to give you the results of these surveys as well as the comparisons and how the items changed.
Hey there, everybody. Before we jump into the results from the study, I wanted to talk a little bit about the faculty who we had participating. Between the 2 courses, we had 12 different instructors who were involved, and 10 of those decided to participate. The 2 who did not really just told us they personally were not interested in being involved in the process, but they did give us permission to review and edit any of their test questions however the group saw fit. So all of their questions were still included in the process, they just individually were not. The biggest differences, I guess, in the participants would be in seniority. We were, just slightly more than half of us had been here, 5 or fewer years. And then the others had been here 6 to 10 years. In addition to that, the major difference was in previous training and item writing. When we asked, so 7 of our faculty members had previous training, and when we asked them about where they received that training, all of them said that they had received faculty development here at our university in item writing. And then also a couple more, 3 of them from that same group told us that they had also received training nationally, either with our national board examination, if they were writing questions for them, or some other discipline-specific credentialing group. We asked them a few other baseline questions, one of which was what factors they felt affected their sense of success in item writing the most. And you can see here that the majority of people say that the way that their item stats work out after the test is administered really does affect how successful they feel. Previous training in item writing was reported as well, and then also student challenges to exam items. We have a process here whereby students can challenge any of the test questions if they come to us in a 2-week window after the test. So if we get a lot of challenges, we feel like we're not doing a great job. So all 3 of these things we thought would be pretty well addressed by the intervention that we had, which included education and going through the process of reviewing these questions throughout these 2 semesters. When we asked our participants if they had participated in peer review of exam items in the past, really only about half of them had, and in those 5 people that reported they had, it was less than half the time. Nobody reported that they participated in peer review of test questions a majority of the time or all the time. Before we jump into the numerical results, I just wanted to comment on what our goals were for this process. The main one was to improve examination quality. And this is, for me personally, definitely my biggest one. If we're using the results of these tests to make decisions about student progression or programmatic or curricular assessment, then I think we can all agree that we need to be basing those decisions on valid and reliable measures. And oftentimes those measures are our test questions. So we need to do our best to eliminate any variability that comes into them by any flaws that we introduce. I'll also say that I think ExamSoft makes it very easy to go into an exam question after the fact and adjust scoring in a variety of ways, and I'm grateful that it's so streamlined with ExamSoft, but I would much prefer that we get it over with on the front end and not have to use that adjust scoring function at all. Because I do think if we're introducing flaws into our questions that are requiring us to make changes later, just think about the effect that that could be having on a student as they're sitting on the exam and thinking about it and figuring out what we're trying to say. Even if we correct it later by adjusting the scoring, I really don't think we're correcting any psychological damage we did to them during that test that could have affected their performance on other questions as well if we had really thrown their train of thought. So for me, improving exam quality was the biggest thing. We also wanted to improve our faculty members' self-rated confidence and success, and we wanted to look at how their opinions changed regarding this particular set of item writing guidelines. Okay, so our first question would be, what happened to the item quality? And this is when I start feeling awkward, because what we anticipated to happen isn't actually what happened. We had several previous studies where we had implemented similar things, and we found that the item statistics really improved. Here, we found that there were no significant differences between the control and intervention items, but there could be a couple of different reasons for that. We're dealing with two different student cohorts. So for the control and intervention sequences, there was really two completely different groups of students. They are definitely similar based on academic factors, but they're not identical. We also had one kind of major change in faculty in between the two sequences. After that control sequence, we lost a member of our faculty to retirement. And that individual was someone who historically wrote questions that were very easy. And so with his replacement, I think we kind of tipped the balance toward more difficult questions by putting in that new faculty member. So you can see here that the intervention items were slightly more difficult, not to a statistically significant degree though, but they also were slightly more discriminating. Again, though, not to a statistically significant degree. And this, like I said, kind of disagrees with what our hypothesis was and what we've seen in other studies that we've done. We also looked at mean student scores on these exams. These did change, again, not in the direction that we thought they would. In the intervention sequence, which is that sequence where we included the review, our students' average score was just a couple of points lower. And you know, this could be for a variety of reasons. As I said, we replaced one faculty member who had written historically easy test questions, but also in our initial conversations about how we were going to apply these guidelines, we had decided to eliminate some item formats that are really on the easier side, like all of the above, for example. It usually tests more easily. And we replaced it with select all that apply in a lot of cases, which could have introduced some additional difficulty. Here's a busy slide for you. This just shows you how our test questions in the two sequences plotted out when we look at a y-axis of difficulty and an x-axis of the point by serial. I think Adam mentioned in the beginning about the levels and how you can split these items out into different categories. Level 1 being, according to the literature, the preferred because it's a good relationship between difficulty and discrimination. And then we've got these level 4s where one's too difficult and one's too easy. You can just kind of eyeball this and see that in our intervention sequence, we definitely had better distribution into level 1. We still had a large cluster in that level 4 that's too easy, but with this being self-care and us shooting for mastery of a lot of concepts that our students will be using in practice daily, we as coordinators did feel that it was appropriate for many of our questions to fall into this category. This table is really just kind of a numerical representation of what you saw on the previous slide, and it might make it a little easier to see here that we have better distribution put with review into those level 1. And you can see we had fewer uncategorizable items and slightly fewer level 4, but as I mentioned, they were still there. Okay, so our second goal was to improve our faculty members' self-rated confidence and success. And so you can see here the results from the surveys that we had administered, whether we're talking about confidence, success, their ability to evaluate test questions, or to implement a formal exam review process like the one we did here. We had statistically significant increases across all of those questions. I think this is really supported by the fact that we did a pretty in-depth review of the item writing guidelines at the beginning of the semester. We revisited them as necessary each time we reviewed items for an exam, and all of our faculty members, if they were available, went through the process of reviewing these questions, whether or not they had questions on each individual exam. So they got theory, they got practice on a repeated basis throughout 2 semesters, and I think it had the effect that we intended. Next, we wanted to ask how our participants' opinions in the item writing guidelines and review changed. This one, you can see we don't have much in the way of statistically significant changes, but that's because we had really kind of positive baseline reports to these questions when our participants answered the pre-survey. So there wasn't a lot of room to move in the positive direction, but you can see that they still answered very positively in the post-survey. So they felt that peer review did very positively affect item quality. On the pre-survey, we had one holdout when we asked them if they were planning to modify future questions with the item writing guidelines, and in the end we got them. We got full 10 yeses on that one. And then we also asked or to what degree will voluntary application of these guidelines affect item quality. That improved as well. There are a couple other things I wanted to share with you from the practical perspective. I wanted to show you all the top 5 guidelines that were broken, resulting in modifications to questions. The first one was just simply to include the central idea of the question in the stem of the question. We have a practice around here by quite a few of us actually to just have really short, like 1 or 2 word stems and then really long choices. The guidelines recommend that we get away from that, and so we did do that, and that represented a lot of the changes that we made. Embarrassingly, a lot of our modifications had to do with correcting our own grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes, but thanks to the review process, we caught it on the front end and we did that. Minimizing reading is another thing that we hit on several times. We eliminated type K questions, or the complex multiple choice. That would include those question types that are Roman numerals, and where then the choice options are combinations of those Roman numerals, or the complex multiple choice could also be options or questions that have options A through C followed by like A plus C, A, B, and C, etc. And you can see there just the list of those that we modified most frequently. And then here at the end, just a quick look at the format changes that we made. We did try to eliminate all of the above. We still had one in there in the intervention sequence. We got rid of some none of the aboves. We introduced a lot more select all that applies. That was how we modified many of our all of the above questions. And that may be responsible for, when we looked back at how the grades changed, our slightly more difficult questions on the intervention sequence. And we reduced our number of type K as well. With that, I'm going to let Adam come back over really quickly and talk to y'all about how we've taken this process and gone on to implement it in some other courses.
Okay, so in self-care, you guys just heard, as David said, this was what we thought was a relatively successful implementation of this item review process in several ways. And so, having had a lot of those faculty members involved, I coordinate the infectious disease module, and a lot of those faculty members that were involved in self-care actually requested that we implement it in infectious disease. One difference in infectious disease as compared to self-care is that we have more basic science faculty in that course, and so that became one of the things that challenges we had when we implemented it. And overall, I would say it was a very big success for us in infectious disease, and that we really we did the same process in self-care, and I think our tests as a whole improved. The faculty members attended the meetings. Even when they couldn't attend, they would email me like changes to questions. And a lot of the same mistakes that we saw in self-care, we also saw in infectious disease. And the nice thing about ExamSoft is that when all of these questions are being updated and being changed, then they're being improved in the faculty members' test bank in ExamSoft. So for future uses on tests, because we do use questions on multiple years, so that being the case, it kind of makes our question bank more rich, and the faculty members seem to like that from a buy-in perspective. We did have one meeting in which a faculty member did get relatively upset and throw the test on the table, that may or may not occur. But by the end of the semester, that faculty member, I think, saw the benefit, and he still attended the rest of the meetings. I think it was just, we all have a case of a Monday every now and again. And so that was kind of our experience in infectious disease. We also did implement it in the endocrinology module, which I don't coordinate, but Laurel does, and she had the similar experiences there. And it was, again, basic science faculty and clinical faculty together. And again, there is, as with any change, I think you are going to have some resistance. That should be anticipated. But I think if you can get kind of a critical mass of people who really see the benefit of this moving forward, that helps to perpetuate it. And the naysayers may exist, and usually they don't even last for a semester in our experiences in these 3 courses. And so with that, if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to entertain them at this time. And then also, we have our contact information up here, so if you would like to directly email us, please feel free to do that too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all 3 of you. What a great presentation. We are going to go ahead and open up the forum for a Q&A session right now. If you have a question for the presenters, now is the time to enter it in the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Guys, we already do have a couple listed here, so I'm going to jump right in if that's okay.
Sure.
Wonderful. First question is, what are some of your top suggestions for faculty buy-in of this type of process?
Well, I would hope that sharing data like we have here would help people with buy-in, although I will admit that the results that we showed today from the tests and the items don't look like they improved very much, but that's actually kind of an anomaly when you look at the literature. For me, we're coming from a place of teaching a healthcare profession within pharmacy. We're always referencing evidence-based medicine, and I think it would be naive of us to not also acknowledge that there's a body of literature describing evidence-based education and assessment. The guidelines that we keep referring to are supported by many pieces of primary literature where they show that if you use them, you can really dramatically improve the quality of your items and eliminate some of those confounders that we introduce when we make errors, and really measure strictly what the student knows. So for me, it's making that point of evidence-based assessment and just getting people to look at the literature with faculty development programs and the articles that are out there.
And I think to follow that up, I think you have to make it practical and meaningful for the faculty member. Some people write on the literature stuff, so I think you have to be very receptive to what may or may not help or encourage particular faculty members. So if you have a faculty member that's continually getting challenges, then that may be a carrot for them, in the fact that if you make better questions, then the chances of having challenges will decrease. So but getting buy-in is just tough. But I think it's that critical mass helps too. Getting those 4 or 5 faculty members that agree and y'all moving forward is a good thing too.
Great, thank you. This is a little bit of a similar question, but I think it has a place at the table. The question is, we're a small program with no dedicated assessment role. How would you suggest we begin this?
Well, I think the model that we presented here is perfect for that, because we have an associate dean of assessment, but the requirements of her job pull her so much more toward accreditation reporting that she doesn't have the time to spend on course level initiatives like this. And so we, just as coordinators of the courses, decided that we would do this ourselves. And I think the grassroots aspect of it really got people kind of excited about it and willing to participate. And also acknowledging our limited resources, I think, helped people agree to just give it a shot and let's try it on our own.
And I think really that's where this model shines, is in those environments, because if you do, there could be a challenge if you do have a formal office of assessment with multiple personnel, then, there's obviously going to be faculty members out there who think they don't have to do this because there's somebody else who may do it from that office. So this was a great opportunity, I think, in that realm of not having a formal office of assessment and personnel dedicated to that. I think this is one model that can definitely increase your assessment quality. And, going forward, I think this wasn't necessarily in the question, but, we've noticed at this point now where we've done this, after everybody has a handle on item writing, which generally for all of us happened during that first semester, and when we were doing this, then you get to a point where you get in these meetings and you start kind of looking around at each other, because people know how to write questions at that point. So I think this has excellent potential moving forward, and what we want to do with it is to take it to the next level of looking at post-exam performance and having this discussion modified away from just item quality to a more broad assessment perspective.
Great, thank you so much. Next question is, what do you think about test review for courses that only have one faculty?
I think it's still probably necessary. I know if I was the only faculty member in a course, I would personally still want some of my colleagues to look at my questions. It's easy to get siloed off by yourself and lose a little bit of perspective, for me anyway. And so I think there's definitely still value there, whether it's people in my department or, people at other schools teaching similar topics.
And even if they're not similar, some of the basic science questions that we reviewed, like an infectious disease, and some of these other ones, there may not have been necessarily a complete understanding of everyone at the table of what exactly the question, the depth of it, because it may be coming from a different angle, and our med chem per se may not be as sharp as it once was. But even in that sense, there's still commonalities in looking at some of these things on how to improve questions. So even getting somebody not within your realm, but outside of that, who's good at writing questions, can still make tons of recommendations that would help.
Great. Next question is, have you seen any type of correlation between student performance based off of item modifications?
Student performance on an individual exam, is that what we mean?
I would say, it's not clarified, but I would say, either student performance on just individually or as a course as a whole.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue, as Adam mentioned, to the program that we'll be doing on September 13th. We did do 2 small studies where, one, we retrospectively looked at a course, dividing questions between those that followed the guidelines and those that didn't. And we found that those that did follow the guidelines were less difficult, but more discriminating. Similarly, we did a prospective small study where we introduced some additional questions that were written to adhere or break the guidelines. And we found again that when the guidelines are broken, we were having more difficult questions without a commensurate increase and discrimination. And so I feel confident that there's a correlation to student performance and how closely we follow many of these item writing guidelines. I would also say that guidelines are guidelines. They're not absolute rules, and there's a time to break them. I just think that when we do break them, we need to have a really good reason to do so.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how quickly is this exam data available to you to use?
I'm not sure what we mean by exam data, but if we're talking about the difficulty and the point by serial correlations, as soon as the students have uploaded their exams to ExamSoft, I can run either a summary report or an item analysis report, and it's immediately available to me. So it really has streamlined the process of us as coordinators sending that psychometric data to the faculty members within our course, having them review individual questions, and then getting back any modifications to us.
And a lot of times it's even real time is a nice thing with ExamSoft in that, like for us, we proctor exams and we have a proctor in the room. And so if I start getting a lot of questions as a proctor for certain questions, a lot of times I'll go log in after a few students have finished the test, and I can look real time at their performance on those questions. So it may not be every student, but you can look real time while you're proctoring or while an exam's going on as they upload their exams, if they upload them and are leaving. So you can look at it as fast as you want to almost.
Fantastic. That is all the questions that we've had come in, guys, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. Again, just really quickly, when you do close out of the webinar this afternoon, you're going to get a pop-up. It's just a quick survey, 5 questions long. We would really appreciate it if everybody would take the couple of seconds needed to fill that out so we can continue to provide relevant content. Also, this presentation has been recorded. You should be receiving an email within the next 48 hours that will have a link to the recording as well as a link to a PDF of the slide deck. I'd like to thank everybody today for attending. Thank you to our presenters for taking time out of what I know is a very busy time of the semester to present this webinar to us, and we look forward to seeing everybody next time. The follow-up webinar, I believe, is on September 13th, and you can register for that at resources.examsoft.com. Thank you so much.